I'm Algenon Cash, and you're locked in. I wanted to have a conversation with a longtime friend of the show and also a longtime mentor and friend of mine, John Hood. John is the president of the John William Pope Foundation and someone who's observed countless elections over the years. So his expert insight is exactly what we need to make sense out of this most recent election cycle. John, how are you today? Thank you for locking in.
I'm doing fine. How are you?
I'm well. I'm well. I've been looking forward to this conversation. I took this weekend and drafted a whole bunch of questions because I think myself and many other people are trying to make sense out of not only our recent national election, but even closer to home here in North Carolina, we had a really big election as well. I guess let's just start there. I know you do a really good job at observing these elections, analyzing the outcome. What was your initial reaction to what you saw here at the national level?
At the national level, I had prepared myself for any outcome because I thought the presidential election was very competitive. It was competitive in at least 7 states. All that turned out to be that was the conventional wisdom, and the conventional wisdom was accurate. I also recognize that when you end up with polling that shows 1 point here, 2 point there, 3 point here, 4 point there, those are all within the margin of sampling error. Polls cannot get any more precise than that without gigantic sample sizes that no one's ever going to pay for. So there just wasn't any uh, statistically valid way of declaring, oh, I know what's going to happen. So I was prepared for either eventuality. And in particular, I was prepared for the idea that even though you've got 7 battleground states where the two campaigns were spending most of their time and energy and money, you should, and they were close, competitive, you shouldn't assume that they'll break half and half, or that it was very possible that Trump would win all 7 battlegrounds, which he did, or that Harris, if she had done a couple of points better in a lot of these places, would she have won all 7. Those were all outcomes I was prepared to see, so I wasn't shocked. I think one of the dangers that we all are vulnerable to is the emotions, being swept up in the emotions of election night or the election morning, the following morning, and drawing all sorts of conclusions based on what are actually incomplete returns and flawed polls. So people went to all sorts of elaborate rigmarole to decide what had happened before they even knew what had happened. Because, for example, a lot of ballots in the western states, in the left coast states of Washington, Oregon, and California, and even some of the other mountain states, those ballots come in days after election day. And even the ones that are in on election day, a lot of those states don't allow you to start counting until the polls close, and it takes days to count them. So people jump to conclusion, for example, that Donald Trump would win a clear and convincing majority of votes cast nationwide. That's probably not what's going to happen when all the votes are counted. He'll probably be at or slightly below 50%. That is a good performance. Obviously, it's a decisive win in the Electoral College, but to call it a landslide is kind of absurd. That kind of ruins the notion of a landslide, which is definitely not winning by a couple of points nationwide.
Well,
It was a decisive win in the Electoral College, and that's how we elect our presidents. So I agree with all that. It's just, this is one example. I saw some memes on the internet, which is already a dangerous sentence to begin, where people were comparing the vote totals in 2024 to 2020 and claiming, there are millions of missing votes. Maybe the election was stolen in 2020. Again, not understanding that a lot of ballots just hadn't been added to the total yet.
Yeah. No, you certainly said early on that you had a good feel that it could go either way. I didn't have that feel. I mean, when you listen to the pollsters, when you look at the polls that were coming out, during the actual election cycle, I mean, it was so tight. I mean, it just felt like it would have been the battleground states would have been more divided than what we currently saw. It does look like obviously at the popular vote level, the vote disparity is starting to narrow in. However, it does look pretty clear that Republicans are going to have control of the Senate, control of the House, control of the White House, and some would even argue control of the Supreme Court because of the number of conservative justices that are now
and the
appointed to the
control
court.
and control Algenon of most state governments.
Most state governments. So it does feel like this was an overwhelming mandate for Trump and the MAGA crowd within the Republican Party. I think Democrats wanted to make this election about January 6th and social issues such as transgender and abortion rights. But in the end, voters said no, it's the economy. Do you think that this is a real lesson for Democrats? I mean, do Democrats really have to do a gut check around how they run these races going forward?
Well, I think they should do a gut check about their economic policies because you're absolutely right. The plurality top election issue was with the economy and specifically inflation. It wasn't fear of losing jobs, which is unemployment rates relatively low. It's inflation, which is one of the most damaging events that could ever happen to an incumbent administration, not just in the United States, but around the world. Lots of governing parties across Europe, uh, other places, they've lost power after the bout of inflation that followed the COVID-19 pandemic. The difference between inflation and unemployment is that even in high levels of unemployment, 10% unemployment, 12% unemployment, the vast majority of people have jobs. But inflation affects everybody. It affects them differently. Lower income people get hurt more by inflation typically than higher income people, but it's a cancer that eats away at the economic body. And so it's just a disaster. And when you look at the numbers, you can see that. This is why I would say, for example, I would not go as far as to suggest that these election results confer some sort of overwhelming mandate
Hmm.
on Trump or MAGA world or anything like that. They weren't the main issues. The main issue was not Biden. It was not Harris. And let me fortify this point with some evidence. If you look at the two different exit polls, actually asking actual voters what they were thinking about, both of them show the following dynamic. Somewhere between 40, 45, somewhere in that range percent of American voters who turned out this year said they had a favorable view of Kamala Harris, maybe personally or maybe just on policy, and they voted for her almost entirely. A somewhat smaller number, 42, 43, something like that, said they had a favorable view of Trump. In fact, Trump still is less popular than Kamala Harris. So how did he win?
Which is crazy to me. Yeah.
Well, here's the thing, though. Here's how he won. The people who said they disliked both of them went for Trump overwhelming. Like 2/3 or more of that group went for Trump, even though they don't like him very much. Now,
Mm.
you can't, I think, convert that into everybody loves the president elect. They absolutely favored him and his stated economic goals and policies over those of the administration they held responsible for inflation. Now, there's other things going on in the election, as you point out. For voters who said that abortion was the number one issue, they went primarily for Harris. People who said immigration was the number one issue, they went primarily for Trump. But very few people said anything about foreign policy, about the environment, about transgender rights. Not a very high percentage identified that as a top voting issue. So those are issues that people care about. I'm not trying to discount that. But if you're trying to figure out why Trump won and most Republican candidates won, or why Harris, more importantly, why Harris lost and most Democrats in the competitive races lost, you will find that it is overwhelmingly about inflation. The voters were angry about it, even though it has subsided, but of course it hasn't reversed. Those price increases are not going to be reversed. They were very angry about it, and they said, "Well, we had Trump, and inflation wasn't there, and we've had Biden, and inflation was there. Let's go back to Trump."
And I want to dig in on that last comment that you made, John, because my audience know I pay very close attention to the economy. I talk about it throughout the year. I write about the economy. I have been on record, and I will stand by this. The U.S. economy is not in bad shape. It is growing. Unemployment is
Absolutely.
down. Interest rates are coming down. The inflation rate is down. However, the last point you made, I think, is what's so potent. Prices are not down. And I think, John, during this last election cycle that we just had, I don't think we had an honest debate about why prices are not down. The reality and the inconvenient truth is that companies are enjoying their new margins and they have no incentive to bring prices down unless they see demand fall as well. And so it feels to me that whether it would have been Harris or whether it would have been Trump, neither party, neither candidate can just get into the White House and directly say, "Hey, companies, bring your prices down." So, to me, John, in this particular election, I continue to say that the reason why it was hard for me to support Trump was because I felt like character is more important than policy. But I think ultimately, for the majority of voters, they felt like their pocketbooks were the most important thing.
I think that's accurate. I wish we lived in a situation where the policy differences weren't yawning and people put a higher premium, not just on character. I agree with you about that, but also on the primary role of the president, which has nothing to do with inflation. It has nothing to do with transgender rights. It has nothing to do with lots of abortion. It's primarily the commander in chief of the armed forces, someone who heads up our foreign policy. You can only have one president heading up foreign policy. I don't think foreign policy got nearly the attention that it deserves, but this is the world we live in. This is what the voters voted on. And I think you're absolutely right about the economy. It would be difficult to argue that today's economy in the United States isn't better than in most of its competing countries around the world, that there aren't lots of positive signs, but people can't let go of how much more they're paying
Mm.
for the basics of living that they used to. And of course, even if there was some lever that a president could pull and make prices go down 10%, well, we actually want deflation in this environment?
No,
Probably not. So what we've experienced is not deflation. I know you know the distinction. It's disinflation. We had a higher level of inflation rate, and that inflation rate has come down closer to what the Fed likes to see, which is around 2%. But that still means prices are rising modestly every year. They're not going down. They're not going to go down on the aggregate.
so, John, I met you because I went through the EA Morris program many, many years ago, and I have credited that program with fundamentally changing my life and the people that I had an opportunity to meet, the lessons and things that I had an opportunity to learn. I would say that in that program, you all taught me the definition of leadership. You sort of ruined me because now now in the real world people don't see leadership and character the same way that you taught me in the EA Morse program. What do we do, John? Because I'm concerned about what does this mean for future elections, not only with on the Republican side but on the Democratic side. It does feel like character and leadership and those kind of qualities are becoming less and less important.
It does feel that way. There is certainly evidence for that at the presidential level. But I would suggest that when you go down the ballot to other offices, and when you think about non electoral leaders, people who are leaders of institutions, I think a lot of Americans, a lot of North Carolinians still care a lot about the character of those kinds of leaders, people who lead organizations, people who lead companies, people who lead firms, people who lead universities, people who lead hospitals, other large institutions, schools in our society. Leadership is still relevant. And we saw that in the gubernatorial race in North Carolina. I think, in a way, the presidency has become the exception
Hmm.
that unfortunately may not prove the rule, but may have a corrosive effect over time. I don't look as long as the majority of the people who voted, or at least a plurality of the people who voted, chose Donald Trump. Many of them believe he is a great leader. But if it had only been those who thought he was a great leader who voted for Trump, he would have lost. He would have lost by a significant margin. He got additional votes from people who do not think he is a particularly aspirational or praiseworthy leader. They question his character or his leadership ability, but they just thought his policies would be better for them, or that Kamala Harris's leadership qualities were lacking, or something like that. So I totally take your point. I feel a little guilty teaching people that character matters, but actually I don't, because character does matter, and it was Will Allen in the end, and we will see what happens over the next several years.
I think you're correct, and I'm trying to remind people that the pendulum always swings. The law of rhythm compensates for all these movements, and I think the pendulum will continue to swing. This was really fascinating to me watching the race. Harris proposed tax credits for small business owners, new home buyers. She wanted to work with the real estate development community to boost the housing stock. Trump, on the other hand, proposed spending $300 billion on finishing his border wall, 200% tariffs, and no taxes on tips for the service industry. Now, if you blindfolded me and didn't tell me the year, I would think that the Democratic policies were the Republican policies, and the Republican policies were the Democratic policies. And maybe I've just now lived long enough to see the inversion happen, but help me and my audience understand what's going on between these two parties, because it seems like the underlying voter base is really starting to shift.
It has shifted somewhat. The stated philosophies of the parties, if you, again, go beyond the presidential race, you look at lots of other candidates running for Congress and legislature and things like that, they still are fairly conventional Republican and Democratic stances. You are, however, correct that in the presidential race, things got scrambled a bit. But I would again suggest that lots of voters, if you ask them which presidential candidate was going to raise your taxes and which presidential candidate was going to lower your taxes, they would have said Harris in the first case and Trump in the second case. According to what the candidates themselves have said, that may not be the correct conclusion. You know, there might be some people who might have had a slight decrease in their income taxes under the Trump rewrite starting in 2025 with the tax code, but maybe tariffs will be up and they'll have a net tax increase, and they wouldn't know that.
Mm.
And there may be people who thought that Harris was going to raise their taxes, but again, according to her stated policies, they would have actually received tax relief. The truth is that not only were not a lot of these details widely understood or widely shared, but I think people are properly skeptical of claims. For example, I know Republican voters who understand that tariffs are tax increases. And when I ask them, well, yeah, but you're voting for Trump, I said, oh, he's not really going to do it. Because, of course, Republicans wouldn't raise taxes. And similarly, I knew folks who were going to vote the other way and told that Kamala Harris had promised various tax decreases and tax incentives. Said, I don't think she'll actually do that. So there is a built up, just like on foreign policy, there is a built up set of assumptions that people have about D's and R's that may not necessarily comport with a particular race, particular policies that, for example, Harris and Trump articulated, but it still matter.
Yeah, I recently wrote about Trump's tariff proposals and the impact that it could have here in North Carolina. For my audience, that's in the Carolina Journal. Go to carolinajournal.com and you can read that and much other commentary that I provided during the election cycle. But these tariffs will hurt. They will specifically harm us right here in North Carolina. And when Trump raised tariffs before, it's surprising to me that people believe he won't do it because he's already done it before. He did it when he was in office the first time.
They argue that it's all a negotiating ploy.
And it actually had a negative impact on agriculture and trade right here in North Carolina. So I think it's very plausible that it could happen again. You know, shifting our attention here to North Carolina before I start to run out of time. Talk about, I mean, my gosh, you talk about split ticket voting here. You know, Trump some kind of way takes the state by, I think, somewhere around 3 points. But then you come down further in the ballot, and Josh Stein is the new governor by 15. Hal Weatherman loses his race. Michelle Morrow loses her race, even though I'm a big supporter of Mo Green. So congratulations to him. And then Dan Bishop loses his race. And it all felt like everybody got so closely tied to Mark Robinson that they all just got pulled under.
Well, some did. I mean, there were 10 council state elections, including the governor's race. So the 9 that were not Josh Stein creaming Mark Robinson, the Democrats won 4 of them, and the Republicans won 5 of them. So the ones that were the closer associated, like Dan Bishop or Hal Weatherman, they were more closely associated with Mark Robinson. Michelle Morrow was also associated with Robinson, but she had her own baggage too.
She did, yeah. And
so those races went to the Democrats. The Republicans won the remaining races, sometimes easily, or fairly easily, 4 or 5 points. They probably will win the Chief Justice race. We'll see. So actually, if you look at the total number of votes cast for one of the two parties for most of our statewide elections, it's like 51-49. We're very closely divided. And I will restate something I have written many times, which is North Carolina continues to have the strongest Democratic Party in the South.
Hmm.
This is the only place I'm aware of now in the South, not the border states, but in the South, where there are any Democrats in statewide executive office. They're all the only Democrats who win those offices live in North Carolina. The only ones.
Hmm.
Kentucky's a little different. It's not really a southern state, but there's a few in Kentucky. But that's about it. So it's partly mistaken, very mistaken nominations by GOP primary voters in 2024. But it's also the Democrats are relatively good at winning elections in a slightly center right state. Democrats have a history of doing well. It hasn't helped them in every area. In fact, the Republicans gained additional county governments that they run. They now have 71 out of the 100 counties where there's a Republican county commission. When I was starting out following politics, that would have been unthinkable. But that having been said, that still means that there are lots of counties, the Democratic county commissions, and you don't find that in as many other places around the South.
It's going to be interesting, I think, going into this new legislative long session, which is set to happen in 2025. Obviously, Stein, he did win by a landslide, clearly. There's some chinks in the armor for the North Carolina GOP party. I think this disastrous run-in of Robinson in the general election is going to continue to haunt them a little bit. And then also, it just feels like, that super majority that the Republicans had in the General Assembly, they no longer now have it. Will Stein even cooperate with state Republicans, or is he already eyeing the 2026 midterm elections?
I think there will be areas of agreement, and there have been with Roy Cooper, for example, or even with Bev Perdue, who was the governor when the Republicans first took the legislature in 2010. There was some areas of agreement. We shouldn't exaggerate the extent to which they never agree about anything. But Stein does have a stronger hand because of that broken supermajority. But it's by one vote, Algenon. So it's important to know there are particular areas, particularly issues, where a number of House Democrats will vote with the Republicans, including
Hmm.
potentially the budget bill. So there's still the Republicans are still in the driver's seat in North Carolina state government because they have the legislature overwhelmingly, and that is the primary source of power in North Carolina government. The three branches are not equivalent. The legislature is more powerful than the executive. But that having been said, as I said earlier, Democrats have had a history in a center right state of holding the governorship, the attorney generalship, some other offices, and doing pretty well with them. And so I think that they will definitely be a player in state government going forward.
Where you could have another Trisha Cotham scenario, where
I
someone
doubt it.
actually
I don't think
jumps
there'll be a
party.
party switch, but I do think there are some members who won't switch parties, but they are absolutely willing to talk to Republicans about on particular subjects. Yes.
You have been very close to the state Republican Party for a long time, even in your role at the John Locke Foundation. You've seen a lot over the years. What is the learning lesson for state Republicans after this campaign with Mark Robinson? What's the takeaway from this outcome?
Some of them have walked away. They told me it's not a problem. I mean, we couldn't control who got the nomination for governor, but we did so well elsewhere. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with our party. That is what
Hmm.
some say. But I would submit that if you know that there is an iceberg, you can see the iceberg 2 years out, and you make no effort to steer your ship away from the iceberg. You can't blame the iceberg. There has to be some thinking, some introspection, and for some there is, about how do we end up in this situation and how do you not have this situation again? How do you coalesce around a consensus, qualified, experienced gubernatorial nominee early on? Of course, the primary is the primary. People can file, and people get to run. It's a free country. But how do you get strong support at the front end for candidates who will present themselves well in the fall? I do think there's one rule change. I don't know that it would have mattered in the governor's race, but I think they should go back in North Carolina to requiring a 40% threshold to avoid a runoff. Right now, you only have to win 30% plus one vote, and there's no runoff. I think that's a recipe for continuing disaster, maybe for both parties. And it would be better to have a higher runoff threshold that you have to get over 40% to avoid a runoff. That way, you don't end up with candidates in the fall who really represent a pretty small sliver of the party's own electorate.
Yeah, for the life of me, I will never come to understand why the party didn't nominate Dale Folwell, and I know that I've got a little bit of preference here because obviously Treasurer Falwell and I go so far back, but his service to the party, his service to the General Assembly, his service to the administration, I mean, everything he's done, it just felt overwhelming to me that he was the right candidate. Now, you'll never know if he could have actually beat Josh Stein, but I do question whether or not maybe Hal Weatherman could have still pulled it out if Falwell was at the top of the ticket, or maybe Dan Bishop would have gotten elected if Robinson wasn't associated with all this. But I do believe that it's incumbent upon the party. When I first got into the Republican Party, 20 plus years ago, the party actually used to help vet candidates and actually help educate about the candidates and why these candidates were strong and why we should support them. And if the party's not doing that, if that's not the role that it's playing, then what's the role of the party? I mean, because anybody nowadays can go on the internet or on Facebook or pick your favorite platform and research your own candidates. But what is the role of the party then, John? If it's not to vet candidates and help people understand who has
It's
the best shot
turn
of
out
winning?
that they would argue perhaps that it's to turn out the vote in the fall. It's to get Republicans elected, whoever's nominated. And of course, you don't really want a state Republican Party apparatus to take sides in a primary. Now, I understand what you mean. You mean
Yeah,
more broadly the party, like people who are
a
in
candidates
at
forum. I
leadership
mean,
roles,
yeah,
who have been significant activists, significant donors, groups of Republicans acting in concert, saying, "Well, this is the kind of Republican we think we should have." You're correct that that kind of more informal but powerful vetting did not happen. Somebody like a Dale Falwell, everybody knew whether they thought he would, eke out a narrow win or eke out a narrow loss. If he were elected governor, he could step right in. He understood how state government worked, and he knew all sorts of people to pick as cabinet secretary. He could have been governor. It seems to me that's your very fundamental test for a candidate, separate from all the other things that candidate can that candidate do the jobs ready to perform at a high level? And if the answer is no, I think it is incumbent upon people with levers of power to attempt to find a candidate who for whom the answer is yes.
no, I totally agree. John, as always, man, I appreciate you locking in. This has been an insightful conversation as normal. I do have one more question for you before you go, because I'm curious about this. I mean, Mark Robinson, he rose to statewide fame. I mean, really from an obscure source. I mean, he gives this powerful presentation at a Greensboro City Council meeting, and I think within 2 or 3 years later, he was lieutenant governor and then running for governor. What happens to Mark after this? Where does he go next? Where should we be looking?
He rose to public awareness by talking, giving an impassioned speech. I think that's his future. I think it's talking, some
Hmm.
sort of talk show, internet, some sort of role like that. I do not think it is electoral politics. I do not think it is serving in a government role and actually having to do a significant government task. I just don't think he has either the experience, even after 4 years as lieutenant governor, or frankly, maybe even the inclination
Yeah.
to do that. But I do think he might enjoy success on the internet, as so many have.
Yeah. No, I think you could be right. I was just hoping you weren't going to say we should look for him in the Trump administration.
I don't think the Trump people want any him anywhere near the administration. That would be
Yeah.
madness.
Well, John, again, thank you. To my audience, make sure you go check out John Hood. He is the president of the John William Pope Foundation. You can find him on Facebook. I'm sure all over the internet as well. And also make sure you continue to stay locked in with WTOB, because every Sunday morning, that's where you can lock in with me. But if you happen to miss me there, hopefully you're subscribed to the podcast. You can always download that on Apple, Spotify, Pandora, wherever you like to get your favorite podcasts. You can lock in there. Until next time, y'all stay locked in. All right. All right. We're clear, John.